What's up guys, Muhammad Farhan Labib here, a second year MBBS student at GMC Guwahati, and in this particular video we will talk about another important aspect of CVS physiology around which a lot of questions can be framed, that is the cardiac output. So the points which will be covered in this video is number 1, the definition and formula of the cardiac output, number 2, the ways to measure the cardiac output, and number 3, which is the most important, that is the regulation of cardiac output, right? So give the heading the definition of cardiac output. So talking about the definition of cardiac output, it is the amount of blood pumped per ventricle per minute. It is the amount of blood which is pumped per ventricle per minute, and its value comes out to be 5 liters per minute approximately, right? Now this cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume into the heart rate. Right now, what is the stroke volume, guys? We know that the stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped per ventricle per stroke, and this stroke volume when multiplied with the heart rate gives us nothing but the cardiac output, right? Now if we put their values in the formula, we know that the stroke volume is equal to 70 milliliters per minute per stroke, right? The stroke volume is 70 milliliters per stroke and the heart rate is 72 beats per minute. So if you multiply them, it comes out to be 5040 ml per minute, which if we express in terms of liter comes approximately 5 liters per minute, right? So the cardiac output is approximately how much? 5 liters per minute. Now before proceeding, guys, let me make you familiarize with another formula for measuring cardiac output, that is equal to the mean arterial blood pressure divided by the total peripheral resistance. Now for remembering this formula, we can apply the analogy of electricity, that is I is equal to V by R, where I is analogous to the cardiac output. I is nothing but the amount of current which is flowing through the circuit, is analogous to what? Is analogous to the cardiac output, right? And V is the potential difference, is analogous to the pressure difference, which is nothing but the mean arterial blood pressure, and R, that is the resistance, is analogous to the total peripheral resistance, right? So this is how the second formula for measuring the cardiac output can be basically remembered using the analogy of electricity, right? And the first formula is basically obvious, that is the cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume into the heart rate, right guys? Now let us talk about the measurement, ways of measurement of cardiac output. Talking about the measurement, guys, broadly there are 2 ways for measuring the cardiac output. Number 1 is the non-invasive method, and number 2 is the invasive method. Non-invasive method basically does not require any invasion in our body and are very simple. They are echocardiography and Doppler studies. Using this echocardiography and Doppler studies, guys, what we can know is the dimensions of aorta. In addition to knowing the dimensions of aorta, we can also find the amount of blood which is present in the aorta. Now this second aspect, the blood which is present in the aorta, is revolutionary in a sense that it can also give us the amount of blood which is basically pumped per stroke by the ventricle, isn't it? So if we can calculate the amount of blood which is pumped per stroke by the ventricle, that is nothing but the stroke volume, can't we calculate the cardiac output using the formula cardiac output is equal to stroke volume into heart rate? Obviously yes. So this is how the non-invasive method via the echocardiography and Doppler studies enables us to calculate the cardiac output. Now talking about invasive methods, guys, invasive methods are 3. Number 1, Fick's principle. Number 2 is the thermodilution technique. Okay, instead of writing thermodilution technique second, we can write the indicator dilution technique. And number 3, nothing but the thermodilution technique, which is also known as what? Which is also known as Stewart-Hamilton technique. Now let us talk about the Fick's principle. Fick's principle basically utilizes the concept of oxygen utilization. for measuring cardiac output. So talking about the formula which Fick's principle uses is CO equal to the amount of oxygen utilized by our body or a tissue per minute divided by the arteriovenous oxygen difference. So if we like basically talk about their units, then the oxygen utilized by our body or tissue per minute's unit will be in terms of ml per minute, and arteriovenous oxygen difference unit will be in terms of ml per liter. So now if we cancel ml and ml, we see that the cardiac outputs unit comes in terms of liters per minute. Now guys, whenever we talk about the measurement of cardiac output using Fick's principle, the one diagram which must stick in your head is this diagram which has been taken from Guyton, right? In this diagram we have the amount of oxygen used, that is 200 ml per minute, right, by our body, and we also have the diagrams of pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. Now coming back to the formula guys, in the formula we have written that we will basically take the arteriovenous oxygen difference. Now how will we get this arteriovenous oxygen difference? For getting this arteriovenous oxygen difference, we need to collect the blood from the artery and the vein. Now which artery will we use and which vein will we use for this for measurement of this Fick's principle? Theoretically speaking guys, this arterial blood will be taken from pulmonary vein and this venous blood will be taken from pulmonary artery, which we can remember by remembering this diagram which has been taken from Guyton, right? Now guys, practically speaking, this pulmonary vein is difficult. It's difficult to obtain blood from this pulmonary vein. So instead of this pulmonary vein, the arterial blood is obtained from any systemic artery. This line has been given in the Guyton textbook, and sometimes questions are framed about where is the arterial blood taken for the measurement of cardiac output. This arterial blood is taken from where? The systemic artery, and this venous blood is taken from pulmonary artery. Very simple, right? Now let us move on to the next measurement, next invasive way of measurement of cardiac output, that is the indicator dye dilution method. Indicator dye dilution method, right? So in this indicator dye dilution method, the dye which we use is cardio green, right? This dye is what? Cardio green. I have written it in the green color so that you can remember. The dye which we use is what? Cardio green. Now the two important properties which any dye must possess for it to be utilized for the measurement of cardiac output using the indicator dye dilution method is number one, properties. Number one property is it has to be safe, isn't it? It has to be safe, right? And the number two property which it must possess is it should remain in the circulation. It should remain in circulation and should not be utilized by any tissue, right guys? So now let us talk about the formula of measurement of cardiac output using this indicator dye dilution method. This formula is CO is equal to Q by CT, where Q is the quantity of dye injected, C is the concentration of the dye in our blood, and T is the circulation time, which is approximately equal to 39 seconds. Alright, so this was all about the indicator dye dilution method. Now let us move on to the third invasive way for measurement of cardiac output, that is what? That is the thermodilution technique. Thermodilution technique, also known as the Stewart-Hamilton technique. So in this thermodilution technique guys, instead of using any dye, we use warm or cold saline, and instead of using the concentration in the blood, we measure the temperature difference, right? And this temperature difference, now guys, how is this temperature difference measured? This temperature difference is measured by thermistors, right? Also, another important point which we should remember in the Stewart-Hamilton technique or the thermodilution technique for measurement of cardiac output is that we need to catheterize the pulmonary artery right? We need to catheterize the pulmonary artery using a catheter known as the Swan-Gange catheter for measuring the cardiac output using the thermodilation technique. The catheter we use is what? The Swan-Gange catheter. And we have to catheterize which artery? The pulmonary artery, right? So that was all about the ways of measurement of cardiac output. Now let us talk about what? Now let us talk about the regulation of cardiac output. Extreme apologies to interrupt in between, but here I would like to take the opportunity to mention that I'm also present on Instagram at the LabMed 1.0, where I put various kinds of quizzes, MBBS contents. Recently, I also put a post about the excitation contraction coupling which occurs inside a cardiac myocyte in the form of a beautiful animation. I would like you to check it out, link in the description. Moreover, I have planned to disseminate my notes through a Telegram channel once I cross the goal of 1000 subscribers. So make sure you subscribe to my channel and get notified. So guys, before talking about the regulation of cardiac output, we need to go back to the formula that CO is equal to stroke volume into the heart rate. So if we know the factors upon which the heart rate depends or the factors upon which the stroke volume depends, we can understand about the regulation of cardiac output, isn't it? Right? So talking about heart rate, guys, we know that this heart rate is under the control of sympathetic and parasympathetic discharge. Sympathetic discharge increases the heart rate by activating what? By activating the beta 1 receptor present on SA node. Right? And this parasympathetic discharge decreases the heart rate by acting on the M2 receptors which is present on the SA node and AV node, right? So SA node mainly, because we are talking about heart rate, so we will talk about the SA node only. We are not concerned about the AV node. So this was about the heart rate. Now before moving on to the stroke volume, let us talk about the dual impact that the sympathetic discharge have on the stroke volume and the heart rate, right? So sympathetic discharge act on the beta 1 receptor present on SA node as well as the beta 1 receptor present on the ventricular myocyte to increase the rate of discharge of what? To increase the rate of discharge of SA node. Similarly, it acts on the beta 1 receptor present in the ventricle to increase the force of contraction. To increase what? Force of contraction of ventricular myocyte. Now, increased rate of discharge of the SA node will increase the heart rate obviously, and the increased force of contraction of the ventricular myocyte will increase the stroke volume. So, this two aspects together will increase the cardiac output. But the question is up till how long? This question can be answered by plotting this graph between the stroke volume, between the cardiac output and the heart rate. We see that there is a linear relationship between the cardiac output and the heart rate up till a certain limit, and that limit is a heart rate of 200 beats per minute. That is, if the heart rate exceeds 200 beats per minute, instead of increase in the cardiac output, the declinement of cardiac output is seen. Now, what is this reason, guys? What is the reason for this limit? The reason for this limit is that if the heart rate increases, the time taken for circulation will decrease, and if the time taken for circulation decreases, the time taken for diastole will decrease. Now, if the time taken for diastole decreases, the amount of blood which will be present in the ventricle at the end of the diastole, that is the end diastolic volume, will decrease, and this will decrease the cardiac output eventually, right? So this was a concept. Now let us move on to the next important aspect, that is upon which factors do the stroke volume depend. So the most important factor upon which the stroke volume depend is the venous return, right? And this venous return again depends on various other factors which can be listed in the form of a flow chart. So the most important factor upon which the venous return depends is the posture. Now guys, whenever we are kind of sleeping, the venous return is normal, right? And whenever we stand, guys, the venous pooling increases. And due to this increase in the venous pooling, there is decrease in the venous return, isn't it? Now, number 2, let us talk about the fact when we walk. When we walk or run, guys, the venous return increases. And why do this venous return increase when we walk or run? This is due to the presence of calf muscle or your peripheral heart, right? This calf muscle is also known as the peripheral heart. And this calf muscle is nothing but which muscle? The soleus muscle. So due to the soleus muscle, also known as the calf muscle or the peripheral heart, the venous return kind of increases when we walk or when we run, isn't it? Now, point number 3 is the inspiration. Whenever we inspire, guys, the venous return increases. Why is this so? While we inspire, what happens is there is a declinement of the intrathoracic pressure. When we inspire, the intrathoracic pressure decreases, right? And due to this declinement of the intrathoracic pressure, the veins pull the blood towards the heart, thereby increasing what? The venous return. Inspiration increases venous return. Number 4 is the sympathetic discharge. Whenever there is sympathetic discharge, the venous compliance decreases. And due to this declinement of this venous compliance, what happens is the venous return increases, right? So next to this, we have something known as the deep fascia of the leg and the venous valves. Again, due to the presence of this deep fascia in our leg and the valves which are present in the veins, the venous return increase. I mean, the venous return is more. So these are the factors upon which the venous return depend. So venous return depends upon number 1, the posture. Number 2, when we walk, the venous return increases. Number 3, when we inspire, the venous return increases. Number 4, due to the sympathetic discharge, the venous return increases. Number 5, due to the deep fascia and the venous valves, the venous return increases, right? Now, let us talk about the regulation of cardiac output proper. For understanding the proper regulation of cardiac output, we need to know about 2 aspects. Number 1, the heterometric regulation. Heterometric regulation, also known as the Frank-Starling law, right? And number 2, the homometric regulation, also known as what? Also known as the ionotropy. So let us talk about the Frank-Starling law, the homometric regulation first. Give heading Frank-Starling law. Guys, what do this Frank-Starling law say? This Frank-Starling law says that the stroke volume is directly proportional to the end diastolic volume. That means the amount of blood which is present at the end of diastole in the ventricle, if increases, this will lead to the increase in the stroke volume. This is obvious, isn't it? Right? So another way of putting this Frank-Starling law is that with increase in the length of the muscle fiber of the ventricle, there is increased force of contraction. Now, how is this possible, guys? Let us see the logic behind. If we say that there is increase in the end diastolic volume, that is, if there is increase in the amount of blood present at the end of diastole in a ventricle, then won't the length of the muscle fiber increase? Now, if the length of the muscle fiber increases, more number of actin, myosin cross bridges will be formed. Now, if there is more number of actin and myosin cross bridges, obviously the force of contraction will increase, and if the force of contraction will increase, the stroke volume will increase. Isn't that obvious, guys? So we have learned about 2 important aspects here. Number 1, the Frank-Starling law can be put in the form of end diastolic volume directly proportional to the stroke volume, and number 2, the length of the muscle fiber directly proportional to the force of contraction of the ventricular myocytes. Right, now let us put it in the form of a graph. If we plot the end diastolic volume on the x-axis and the stroke volume along the y-axis, we'll see that this direct proportionality holds up till a certain limit, beyond which a declinement in the graph is observed. And what is that limit, guys? That limit is the length of 2.2 micrometer of muscle fiber. This 2.2 micrometer is the optimum length, beyond which a declinement of the graph is observed. So this was all about the homometric regulation. Now let us talk about the heterometric regulation. This was all about the heterometric regulation. Now let us move on to the homometric regulation, right? So before proceeding, let me say why is this known as heterometric regulation? This is known as heterometric regulation because we see that the length of the muscle fiber is not constant here. We are seeing that the length of the muscle fiber is increasing, right? So this is why it is known as the heterometric regulation. Now let us move on to the next point, that is the homometric regulation. Homometric regulation, also known as what? Ionotropy. Now for understanding this homometric regulation of ionotropy, we have to plot a graph between the stroke volume and the end diastolic volume. Let me put the end diastolic volume in the x-axis and the stroke volume along the y-axis, right? According to the Frank-Starling law, we saw that the graph between the end diastolic volume and the stroke volume looks like this. Now let us see what happens if we do a kind of left shift to this graph. If we do a kind of left shift to the graph, we see that at constant end diastolic volume, increment in the stroke volume is seen, right? If we do a left shift of the graph, we see that at constant end diastolic volume, there is increment on the stroke volume, right? We have kept the end diastolic volume constant and still the stroke volume is increasing, isn't it? So this is nothing but your homometric regulation. Now why is this homometric regulation? Because guys, we know that if EDV is kept constant, doesn't that mean that the length of the muscle fiber is also constant, right? And since the fact that the length of the muscle fiber is constant, this is known as what? Homometric regulation. Because the length of the muscle fiber is what? Because the length of the muscle fiber is constant. Now guys, if the end diastolic volume is constant, how is this increment of this stroke volume achieved? This increment of this stroke volume, reason for increment of stroke volume is due to increased calcium concentration. Increased calcium concentration inside the myocytes, isn't it? And since there is increased calcium concentration, the stroke volume is increment on the stroke volume is achieved, right guys? And due to the fact that there is increased calcium concentration, this homometric regulation is also known as what? Ionotropy, right? So due to the fact that there is increased calcium concentration is found, this homometric regulation is also known as ionotropy. Now let us learn about some positive ionotropic agents. That is the agents which cause this ionotropy. Number one in this list is the catecholamines. Number two is caffeine. Number three are drugs like digitalis and digoxin. Number four is decrease in heart rate, can also act as a positive ionotropic agent. And number five is exercise. Let us talk about catecholamines. We know that the catecholamines include the epinephrine, norepinephrine and dopamine, isn't it? Now what do they do guys? They bind with the beta 1 receptor, right? Upon binding with the beta 1 receptor present in the ventricular myocytes, what will happen is there is increased cyclic AMP, increased second messenger known as the cyclic AMP. Since this beta receptor is a which kind of receptor? It's a GS kind of receptor. That means the G protein linked receptor of the S subtype, right? Now whenever there is increased second messenger cyclic AMP, then obviously what will happen is it will stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release what? To increase the cytoplasmic calcium concentration, thereby increasing the stroke volume. Now what do this caffeine do guys? This caffeine increases the cyclic AMP directly via the enzyme 5-phosphodiesterase. Now what do this digitalis and digoxin do guys? This digitalis and digoxin blocks the sodium potassium pump. We know that the sodium potassium pump pumps 3 sodium outside and 2 potassium inside. Now if this pump is blocked by this digitalis and digoxin, what will happen is the cytoplasmic concentration of sodium will increase. This cytoplasmic concentration of this increased cytoplasmic concentration of the sodium will be kind of exchanged with calcium. Now so there is increased calcium concentration inside the cytoplasm, and this will induce positive ionotropy. Now guys, let us talk about the fourth point, that how this increased heart rate acts as a positive ionotropic agent. Now whenever there is increased heart rate, what will happen is the calcium will get less time to re-enter the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So more calcium is available. More calcium available means positive ionotropy. And obviously we know that exercise will also act as positive ionotropic agent, right, by increasing the ventricular myocyte contractile strength. So this was all about the this was all about the cardiac output. So in the subsequent videos we will deal with the subsequent topics. Thank you.